Hey everyone, how's it going today? Hope everyone's having a good day. My name is Nick Van Wiggeren. I am the VP of Engineering here at PlanetScale, based in Seattle, Washington, and I'm joined by Matt Lord, who will introduce himself in a second. And we are here today to talk about the database maturity model. We're going to kind of break down kind of the journey that databases go through into a series of different stages, talk about what's different, kind of what the most important considerations are, and take you through a journey about what it means to grow a database alongside a company, and what you should look out for in each of those stages. So, Matt, I'll give you some time to introduce yourself, and then maybe we can intro the group to what those stages are and kick it off.
Sure. So thanks, Nick. Again, my name is Matt Lord. I'm a principal engineer at PlanetScale, and I've been privileged over the last 20 plus years or so to help customers at the vendor. So at MySQL and MongoDB, for example. So on the vendor side, to help customers kind of address their current and future needs. So kind of I get to see things from that side, as well as being a user and operator of those and similar systems and having to go through this similar process myself. So I'm excited to just kind of walk through at a high level kind of what we've all seen in the market. I'm sure a lot of it will be familiar with you or to you, but gives us an opportunity to just kind of lay it all out in, I think, a meaningful and hopefully helpful way.
Yeah, let's be honest, Matt. You and I are in the database journey every single day, so it's a bit of a privilege to be able to actually kind of spell it out for people, condense our thinking a little bit, and it's always good when we get an opportunity to share some of the decades of database experience that we've built up. So, do you want me to go ahead and kind of introduce the first phase? We can go through top of line, kind of swap off.
Yeah, we can swap back and forth. That works.
Awesome. So, throughout this talk, we'll be chunking the database journey down into roughly four phases. And we're doing that so that we can talk about what the different markers and needs are at each one of those phases, share some anecdotes about what we've seen as databases have been, inside of those different phases, and hopefully just kind of talk about, again, what you should look for, what we're looking for as we work with customers, as we work with databases who are in these phases. So, again, four phases. The first database phase is what we call the idea or ideation phase. So that's kind of that 0 to 1 journey. That when you're first starting a project or first starting something out, you really begin in the idea phase. Matt, I'd love if you could talk about the next phase.
Sure. So then once you've gotten some traction from some combination of users, if it's a public service, if you're building something open source, for example, or from investors, if it's not something that's available to the wider market yet. And so now you're going through the process of actually making this commercial product, which comes with a whole bunch of additional requirements and considerations that you don't really have to care about during that ideation phase. And you don't want to, right? Because you just want to move as quickly as possible through the ideation phase.
Absolutely. If you're lucky enough to get past this phase two, the next phase that we'll talk about is what we call growth. And growth is that kind of phase where you're going, maybe you're a little bit more set, you've got your product or your offering or your database is a little bit more down. And then you're talking about adding customers, adding data, and what it really takes to go from maybe a little database to really beginning to grow that into the full-fledged company driver that databases often are.
Yep, and then after that, which is typically kind of the final phase, again, now you've been really fortunate. You've sustained growth over a long period of time now, and typically you would start off servicing wherever your company is headquartered, so whether that's the U.S. or Europe or Africa, wherever it may be. And so you've grown to the point where now you've got users all around the world who are like, I love your service, I love the product you're offering, but from where I'm at, the latency is a little high, and it causes a bunch of other problems. So then you begin to think about, okay, how do we provide kind of a great experience to users no matter where they're at on the globe, whether they work here and then they travel here. And so there's a whole laundry list of relatively complex things that then you have to really start considering and architectural issues. So we were just going to touch on that as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that intro. So let's jump right in. So What's the first phase your database goes through? Idea or ideation. What are some common markers of a database in this beginning phase, Matt? What would you say is characteristic of someone who's just kind of beginning their database journey?
And so I think, especially today, everything is very developer focused. There are just a ridiculous number of really great frameworks out there. So typically a user would have, they'd say, I'm most comfortable in this language, whatever it is, Python, Golang, C++. And then that'll lead to them to some popular frameworks that make things easier. And then that might have an ORM as well. And so a lot of times those things will then lead to whatever the database choice is. And it's not much of a consideration at that point because typically the database is not really the value that you're bringing to your users. It's just an implementation detail. So you end up picking the database that kind of fits well with your total development environment, and then you just ideate as quickly as you can. And all you care about as far as the database is, hey, store my data, give me my data, and that's about it.
Totally. And a common thing that I see is as a developer myself and as I work with other developers, really the biggest constraint on this, like Matt said, is kind of the change throughput. So at this stage, you're probably working with test data or a limited amount of data. So you can dump the entire database, recreate the entire database, drop a table, recreate a table. And a lot of the times what I see, in here is, let's say a one-to-one relationship should have been a one-to-many relationship or something like that. And the kind of core, I think, part of this is the database is growing alongside your understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. The database is a tool that you're using to kind of realize what your idea is. And that way, it's almost like a tool. It's like a chisel or something like that. And you may not even be kind of aware of what all of those trade-offs are. Like Matt said, you may have grabbed something you're familiar with or grabbed something that is recommended by the community or the language that you work in. And your goal is not necessarily to grow the best database. Your goal is not to end up with the best schema. Your goal is to get something out there in the world, get a website or a product out there in the world. And the database is just one part of that journey, along with the stack that you choose, where you deploy it. And you're answering a million different questions at once when you're kind of in this stage. The database really just needs to get out of your way and let you realize that vision. Matt, I'd love, do you have any examples where you've seen people in this stage or where you yourself have been in this stage and kind of you've really needed to get that first iteration out there?
Yeah, I think I haven't really been through this myself. Well, that's not true. I guess at individual products within a larger company, I've certainly been through that phase. But even more so, I've helped a lot of other users of the database go through this phase. And I think you touched on all the key points. The biggest thing is you're not investing a lot of time up front in defining the schema and getting all the relationships right. Again, you might have just a few tables. You're not normalizing it. Again, you don't care about that stuff at this point. As long as it performs well enough for you to get a prototype that's usable and you can show to other people, you're good. But then, of course, I like the analogy of tools, of course, in kind of bringing that back to a non-tech space. So, if you're building a quick prototype to show someone an idea and it's a chair or a desk or whatever, you just grab whatever saw you have. You don't put too much thought in it, right? It's just a tool that you're trying to use to build up this concept that you can show to people. But of course, if you get traction and then you've got to build 1 million of them, that particular tool, that saw, becomes a really critical part of the whole puzzle. And so that's kind of where that leads us into the next phase.
Yeah, and I love that. The last thing I'll say on this phase is, for me personally, it's both part of my favorite and least favorite phase. So a lot of what you're doing in this is really what I like, boilerplate. You're saying, okay, we need a user, we need an organization, we need a credit card, we need you're really setting up just so much that you almost don't even want to think about that core component. A lot of times you're really just breezing through it as fast as you can, breezing through. There are a lot of tools like Prisma or even, Active Record and Rails that really make this a lot easier. You may be, again, thinking about objects and thinking about just how you're storing data and pulling data out. We'll get into this a bit in the launch phase, but this is also one of those stages that if you get wrong, can have really big consequences later on. So Matt, why don't we move on to that phase 2, that launch phase, if you'd like to introduce this, and we can talk a little bit about, what that means.
Yeah, so I think at this point, you've been fortunate enough to gain traction. Again, maybe you've gotten enough investors. If it's not a public product yet, that allow you to continue the development and get to this phase where now you're about to launch this public product, or it's kind of more of an open source service or product, and now you're getting to the point where you want to provide this to users and put that key label on there as production ready or GA or and at this point now you care about all that stuff that you may not have before. Again, like if you think about it as the tools that you're using, once you go to scale with something, each individual tool and kind of the entire pipeline, if you will, or the assembly line that goes into it becomes critical. Like if any part of that breaks down, the whole system falls apart. And so this is where you really start to think about, okay, now that we have this product, we're going to need to ensure that it's up and it's running, that it's performant enough as the number of users scales. So you would typically kind of forecast, we expect this or target this number of users, and we expect each user to make these number of calls. And so you're trying to kind of gauge what your traffic is going to look like, what resources you're going to need. And then you got to think about how you're going to be able to meet that. So, how are we going to automate high availability of all the key services? How are we going to observe and monitor the system to know when we might need to tweak something, scale an individual component up? We're going to need backups, and we're going to need to do that as an online operation. So really all these kind of typical things that in this space you might think of, certainly if in the database operations space, that you kind of take for granted. This is when all that stuff first comes up, and you really have to start investing some time and energy in how you're going to do it, what systems you're going to use, and so on.
Yeah, totally agree with you. This is one of my least favorite phases of the database journey because I often, again, am optimizing. You're optimizing for time in that first phase. And now in the second phase, all of a sudden, all of the things, all of the assumptions that you made in the data model, all of the assumptions that you made in how you deploy your database, what software you use, all of a sudden they're locked in. So a great example of this is if you get your user and organization relationship wrong at this stage, right? Maybe users own organizations instead of organizations in owning users, kind of in the data model. Now that you have live users on the product, it's a million times harder to go ahead and do a database migration to be able to change that. So all of the quick kind of little pieces that you did to get that first iteration, now all of a sudden every single one of them was a decision, and it's a decision that may be incorrect based on more data. And there's also just so many little things that you need to get set up. So did you think of a backup story? Did you think of a restore story? Are you testing your backups to make sure that they're valid? Are you testing to make sure that you can migrate your schema in a zero downtime way so that when you do find a data model correction that you need, you can kind of change it quickly? And this is where the velocity really gets in. So I've worked on a number of projects where you get to this launch and it's often a big push. It's, you're putting kind of everything on the line to get here. And then you realize that steps that would have taken you a day or an hour before now take you a week because you need to go back and figure out, well, how do I do this without losing data? How do I deploy my code and deploy my database change at the same time so that they both work? And these are all the struggles that kind of being in production provide, and that there is not just one way to do it right. So even if you've picked an ORM from your language, even if you've picked a popular database, here's where you really have to start to chart your own course. Here's where you really have to figure out, okay, here's how we're going to do database changes. Is it, are we managing our schema in Git, and do we have a process with GitHub Actions to change our schema? Are we using a schemaless database like MongoDB? Well, how do we make sure that when we deploy our application that reads or writes from different parts of the document, that we update the old documents in sync and that we can read them? And so, as you're growing, and oftentimes at a successful startup, if you kind of have product market fit, you're answering all of these questions while also under immense growth. So while you're also struggling to make sure the database can even stay up at all. I can't tell you how many times one bad query that's missing an index or one query that happens to do a table scan on one page all of a sudden can take down the entire site. And you have to become an expert DBA all of a sudden to debug that, get the code change out, and bring the website back up. And this even happens in later phases, right? I've seen plenty of cases where one bad page or one bad query can be so impactful that even at a large scale, it takes down the whole database. I've seen this at GitHub scale, and I've seen this at much smaller scale. So I think part of the takeaway in this launch phase for me is that this is when all of your decisions start to be questioned, and this is when your database needs to make sure it's providing as much as possible for you. or you're gonna end up lowering your overall business velocity to go kind of take care of the database behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think the most common one that I've seen by far is one that Nick touched on, and that's kind of indexing. So as a developer, oftentimes you'll have a framework, and obviously you're modeling your application objects, and there's so many good frameworks now, especially today, that will uh, model that down at the database layer. So as far as your schema goes in the model, there's not a big impedance mismatch there generally today, and you don't have to worry about it so much. But everything's fast when you don't have much data and you don't have a lot of users. But suddenly when those two variables change, now, as Nick said, like you have a query that's maybe doing a full table scan or scanning a large part of the table. And that's really fast because everything's in memory when you have a small data set and one user. But as soon as you start ramping up users, it just falls apart. And so I think by far the most common one is at this point, you really need to start thinking about what your data access patterns look like, what your common search predicates are going to be. Looking at users by email address, for example, and making sure that you have indexes on all those key fields. That's probably by far the most common one that pretty much everybody encounters.
100%. So let's say we've made it now, we're at a steady state. We can handle the growth. We've got our backup story, our restore story. We're kind of hitting our 5 nines or 4 nines or 3 nines of uptime. That will depend a lot on what you're looking for, what industry you operate in. Let's talk about that real growth now. We've got our data model down. We've got the core features of our product. Our database is doing what it needs to do. What happens when you really hit that growth?
Yeah, I think this is, again, you're pretty privileged to get to this point. So now that privilege and comes with a lot of additional responsibilities. I think more and more, of course, you have a business now, and you're trying to have a continually successful business. But you're also, as you get more growth, you also have other businesses and other users that are then dependent on your services. So, okay, now how do we kind of maintain this growth and maintain the service that allows us to keep those existing customers happy and then grow and gain additional users as well. So again, you're going to continue to fine tune all the performance stuff that we've talked about before. That's just a never ending cycle. So for existing stuff, but also, of course, you're going to typically be adding new features, which means new objects and new schemas. And so that's just a constant iteration that you'll be going through, but it just becomes more and more critical, again, as your data set size grows and as your user base grows. But now you've also got to deal with a whole bunch of other things that maybe you didn't before at all, or certainly it wasn't as big of an issue. So as your user base grows, you're going to have to deal with typically a number of localized regulatory compliance issues. Let's say you have to deal with PCI and other things that come up, and there's always kind of new requirements that are being brought out. There's a certain number, or there's a certain set of encryption ciphers that are no longer considered safe. For example, like PCI has gone through that cycle where now you're not supposed to use anything TLS, anything before TLS 1.1, for example. So you really got to spend a lot of time and effort on those kinds of things. Then you've also got to think about, okay, now before we were, let's say when we started in the growth phase, we were okay with 4 nines or even 3 nines availability. So we wanted to have that automated, but we didn't need to try and get to 7 nines or anything right off the bat. And so now as you go, now you're going to think about, okay, how can we improve our availability scenarios? What can we be tolerant to so that we continue to provide this service that more and more users are depending on in a reliable manner? And then that leads into disaster recovery as well. So we also want to become tolerant now to, let's say if an entire AWS region goes down.
Yep.
We don't want to be down for an indeterminate period of time. It's not okay. Our users aren't going to be okay with us just saying, well, Amazon, AWS region is down, so we'll be back up whenever that changes. So then you got to start looking at disaster recovery and then thinking about how you're going to have this kind of passive setup in another region, and you're replicating all of your data there and all of your infrastructure so that if necessary, you can kind of flip the switch and bring everything up on this other region. And that's probably another big thing that most people will encounter as they get past that initial growth phase.
Totally. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the request line here. Theo asks, any pro tips on database maintenance over time? Things like not using reference actions and cascade can easily leave us in a bad state after seemingly simple action like deletes. So I think this is a great question. And what this comes down to is a lot of what do you use the database for? What do you do in your application? And how do you think about problems like deleting data and changing my data model over time? So I think there's a lot of different schools of thought on this. Some people really like to push a lot of their integrity down to the database. I know some databases support very specific constraints. An example I've seen is, if you run a restaurant reservation system, you can use the database to make sure that the reservation end time is after the reservation start time. You can make sure that when the reservation gets deleted, all of the other pieces of data that cascade are also deleted. And I think when you get to this growth phase, and especially when you get to this phase 4, a lot of the time, the flexibility of the business and the flexibility of what you need from your database makes those systems really difficult to maintain. So one of the hardest systems to change is the database. And so anytime that you put business logic all the way in the database, it really, really embeds that in the core of your assumptions. So in my experience, and most of the projects that I've worked on, we've actually used a lot more of the application to enforce these than we have the database. So instead of using cascading deletes, every time you delete a resource, it enqueues a background job. And that background job looks for all of the relations for that resource that you deleted and can actually perform all of the business logic. What that also allows you to do is that instead of using cascades, if you're deleting an organization, let's say, you can email every individual user at that same time to let them know. You can clean up all of the data behind and kind of make sure that the system stays in a good spot. So for me, I think the most important thing to think about this database maintenance is to not leave it up to chance. If you're doing it in the database, that may work. And I think as you get to the growth and the scale part, it is harder and harder to maintain because you've got more complicated business logic and you're probably wanting to do more with your database. But from the very beginning, even when you get into that first phase of IDing or second phase of launch, you really have to make sure that every action a user can take, that you've mapped out the consequences of that, and that you have systems in place to make sure that the data kind of remains and keeps its integrity. And so my advice really is don't leave anything to chance. Don't assume, don't leave hanging relations. Really, really make sure that every part of the user journey, every part of the data journey, you have really well mapped out in your code and your database. Being able to keep things clean like that will give you a ton of dividends down the line as you go and maybe shard your data or spread your data across multiple databases and multiple systems. If you're already handling deletes in code, you can also handle deleting user from Stripe. You can handle deleting user from the other 3 external systems. And you've got that kind of background job expertise in your back pocket already to make sure that you apply it to your database as well. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you, Matt. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I would just say that I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think there's a simple, easy answer to that. I think obviously there's each individual database software, or I should say kind of storage solution will have certain features that help with that, whether that's check constraints for things on the way in, of course, strong data types for what you're actually storing, triggers and foreign keys, with cascading deletes and all those kinds of things. And those are certainly helpful. I think whenever you have those available, I think it makes sense to use them. Of course, anything comes with a trade-off. But when you get to a certain scale, I think then I think as a business and a product. So now a lot of times those things that you were using on the database side, the trade-offs become problematic when you get to a certain scale, and that kind of leads us into the next phase. But whether or not that's true, I think you end up with a pretty big data landscape. So you start off with your databases, you make them highly available, you make them disaster tolerant, but eventually you have other systems that have to rely and share these pieces of data. So you're copying some, transforming it. So you have the CDC or change data capture system, you've got a data warehouse. And so it becomes a much more kind of complex issue as far as kind of how do you keep all of this data in sync in a reasonable way that doesn't hamper the feature set or performance of your key user-facing systems. And so that's really when I think you get to that point, you need a strong data team. So you need a strong storage team. You'll have a data science team typically. And you coordinate across those teams and the systems to really ensure that your data is correct, that it's sanitized where needed, that it's valid, and so on. And unfortunately, it's not a simple answer, but I think it ends up being a combination of a whole bunch of different things.
If only these answers were straightforward. That would be fantastic. But you mentioned a lot of, I think, of scale, and I see we have a question about multi-region. So I'm going to try and answer part of this as we move to phase four. So by the time we're here, by the time we're in this kind of third phase, getting into this fourth phase, which we call hyperscale, this is where a lot of existing database technology really starts to get, I would say, creaky, right? Your backups are taking longer, your restores are taking longer. You may be outgrowing a single machine. You may be thinking of going and buying an IBM mainframe so that you can run MySQL on 256 cores. You may be asking yourself how you got here. This is a problem of success, but it won't feel that way when you're really trying to scale and eke out the last little bit of performance in your database. So Matt, really quickly, if you could, what are some of the problems and the common markers of really being in this hyperscale scenario?
Yeah, so I think at the storage layer itself, I think through the earlier phases, of course, you start off with this is the single virtual machine or the single machine that's running our database, and then you continue to scale that up. Oh, we need a bigger VM, we need bigger hardware, and you continue to do that until you reach the scaling limits of just simply what you can do as far as the storage set size, the memory size, the concurrency, and so on. And so then, you would vertically or functionally partition your data. So, instead you have maybe you have a user database or schema and products and orders and so on. And so you'll split those out vertically. So now you have an orders database and a products database and so on. And at the application layer, you will piece that data together. And then that allows you to go quite a bit further. But then eventually each of those individual databases that you've split off are also hitting the scaling limits of of a single machine. And so what you really get into at the beginning of this hyperscale phase is, okay, now we're going to have to horizontally partition the user's data set and the products data set. And that's really, as Nick hit on, this is really when you start to hit a lot of issues with the database software. Even with something like MongoDB, that's always had support at some level for sharding as kind of one of their flagship features. Once you actually get to that point, you realize there's a lot of rough edges. You have to use Mongo S. There's certain features that you no longer have available to you and things like that. So there's a lot of trade-offs to make, and you have to deal with those things throughout your systems. So that's certainly the biggest one is, okay, now how are we going to shard our data horizontally to split it out? And then beyond that, then the biggest one is, okay, now we get back to the issue of, okay, now we have users around the globe.
Yep.
And the user who is in Japan is not going to have a great experience if they're going all the way to US East 1 in the US, for example, for every request back and forth. So now you've got to think about, not only do we need to partition this data horizontally, but we need to position it geographically so that no matter where this particular user is, they still have a good, somewhat uniform experience. And so there's a couple of different ways, couple of different paths that you can take to get there, but that always ends up being a big challenge that ends up taking a lot of your
Yep.
resources.
Totally.
And then beyond that, you've got the local compliance as well. So this user who's in Japan is going to have very different local laws that you as a service provider are going to have to meet in order to continue to provide your service there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Matt. So I want to take a couple of questions. We'll start with a question about multi-region. How important is multi-region availability across your database? And I think this is a great question. Multi-region is something that means different things to different people, and it means so many things at once. So my short answer here is it really depends on what you actually want out of multi-region. The question I would ask myself is, am I building multi-region because it's cool? Am I building multi-region to give lower latency to people around the globe? Am I building multi-region to have more kind of uptime and security? It may be the answer to some of those, but the real question that I think you want to ask is, what am I trying to architect? For uptime, for example, it may be much easier to just be in multiple Amazon availability zones. If you can quickly fail your database over from one of the AZ to the other two AZs, you may be able to get pretty much the exact same uptime with a fraction of the complexity. If you're looking to give faster performance to people who are maybe in Asia Pacific or in Europe when you're based in North America, what you may want is just replicas so that you can send kind of bulk reads and some portion of the traffic over to a more local database. And again, that may be much more simple or easy to use than a big multi-region setup. So I would say ask yourself what you're looking for and then tailor the best solution to that answer, and don't just jump right into multi-region. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I would only say that I think that's a good example of that none of these decisions are purely technical decisions. It involves working with the business team as well, because everything has a cost. So you have to determine what's the cost to our business in terms of revenue, in terms of reputation. If the very unlikely event of an entire Google or Amazon region going down, and then how much is it going to cost to be multi-region in order to support that, and so the business decisions comes into play in all of these aspects and at all these points in time. So it's really something, how important it is something that you'll have to decide in each individual case.
Awesome. Totally agree. So we'll end on this last question from Brent. The question is, what are one of the top things you know now you wish you knew when your product is a critical component for other businesses? And this is just such a fantastic question, because underneath this are so many different considerations, and a lot of these are things, common pitfalls that you only realize exist after you've become this. So I could probably talk for hours about this, but I think one of the most important things from my perspective is to understand what those components are, what people are relying on, and make sure that you're very upfront about the expected uptime, the expected request throughput, the anticipated use cases, and the unanticipated use cases. I have no doubt that any API that's made public will get used in a way that you can't expect. But the key is to know upfront, what are the metrics that you're looking for? When do you know when something's gone right? When do you know when something's gone wrong? So monitoring, metrics, and a lot of these kinds of things, you'll almost inevitably end up with a scenario in which you've let someone down, or a scenario in which someone hits a performance edge case because they've got 10 million records when you expected that they would only have 100. And so you really have to be very upfront with letting them know the status of that component of your business. So if something goes wrong, they know exactly kind of what the expected mean time to recovery is and who they should reach out to. And again, it's just being very proactive. So how is it scaling? What is the volume? When that customer that hits 10 million, you should know by the time they hit 500,000 if you were only expecting 100, and you should understand their use case proactively. So a lot of this is a lot like some of the database maintenance questions. You just have to think of these things before they're really going to be a problem, and you have to really plan for them, understand how your database is being used, understand how your product is being used, and build the tools and build the systems so that you can do this analysis, whether it's logs, distributed tracing, query logging. All of these are tools in the tool belt, but you have to develop them kind of at that phase 2 or phase 3, or it'll be too late by the time you realize that someone is using something in kind of a zany way, and you've gotten yourself in trouble. So thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. And like I said, send me a message on LinkedIn. I'd love to talk about this more. This is one of those things that you really only learn by doing it the wrong way over and over again, until something teaches you to do it the right way. Anything to add, Matt, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would only echo that it's a great question. And I think the two things just quickly is one, try to eliminate and avoid assumptions about how some feature or how a product's going to be used, because too many times you end up being completely blown away by like, oh, why would you do that? Or why, like, they're using a product in a way that or a feature that you hadn't even envisioned. And it turns out being, the design decisions that you made when you were building it were wrong. So think about any potential way that it can be used, talk to your users. And I think it's a difficult problem, but look for ways to correct or adjust your assumptions whenever possible is probably the biggest.
Totally. Agree with Theo as well. Primitives, not use cases, can be so powerful. If you are putting something out there for people to use, think like a platform. Don't think what is this API call going to get someone, but think, how are people going to use this? What primitives, what kind of baseline can I create that will let people be innovative on top of my platform? That comes with a lot of pain when people use it in ways that you couldn't think of, but it also makes your service, it makes your product so much more powerful when people are ready to rely on that. So I know we're a bit over time, and I really want to thank everyone who listened. Thank you, Matt, for joining. One of our DevRel folks are doing a Twitter space at 2 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Pacific today. So in just a bit. So check out James Quick in the PlanetScale Twitter. we would absolutely love to have you just bump right over there. And thank you so much for your time. It's been a huge pleasure chatting with you. I'll have a great rest of your day.